family is safe and protected and we're uplifted and still make time for date night. Be oftentimes after school with him, helping with his antiques and watching.
Long before the relationship became a public royal crisis, Catherine had reportedly begun noticing small moments that troubled her. Questions about protocol, private boundaries, loyalty, and the future of the monarchy. At first, they seemed insignificant. But according to the emerging story, those concerns were only the beginning. Catherine had learned one lesson during her years inside royal life: the smallest choices could carry the greatest weight. A misplaced word, an unexpected request, even a change in precedence could become something much larger once it passed through palace corridors. She had survived by watching carefully, speaking cautiously, and understanding when silence was safer than confrontation. That was why her growing unease was so difficult to dismiss. There was no single explosive incident, no dramatic argument that suddenly divided the family. Instead, it was a pattern: small moments, private questions, subtle differences in how royal boundaries were understood. At first, Catherine reportedly resisted drawing conclusions. Meghan was entering an institution filled with rules that were rarely explained clearly. Some traditions were written down. Others existed only through expectation. Catherine understood how isolating that could feel, because she had once been the outsider learning where to stand, what to say, and when personal instinct had to give way to royal duty. So she allowed space. She watched. She waited. But the questions continued. Inside the monarchy, jewelry is rarely only jewelry. Invitations are rarely only invitations. Photographs, seating arrangements, private access, ceremonial order, and even who receives certain information can quietly reveal who is trusted, who is protected, and where someone stands within the institution. Catherine knew that challenging those boundaries could create consequences far beyond one uncomfortable afternoon. That knowledge left her trapped between two dangers. If she spoke too soon, she risked appearing territorial, suspicious, or unwilling to welcome Meghan. If she remained silent, she feared that something more complicated could grow behind closed doors until nobody could control it. And slowly, one question began disturbing her more than the others. Was she merely defending traditions because they were familiar? Or was she recognizing a problem that senior palace figures had not yet fully understood? For a time, Catherine kept those thoughts largely to herself. Then came a private discussion, quiet, seemingly routine, and easy to underestimate. Yet something said during that exchange would finally push her beyond observation and toward a warning. But Catherine's unease might have remained nothing more than private instinct had one seemingly ordinary palace discussion not revealed just how differently the two women understood what belonging to the monarchy actually meant. The real divide was not supposedly about dresses, headlines, or who stood where on a balcony. It went much deeper. Catherine had spent years learning that royal privilege came with surrender. Meghan appeared determined to preserve independence. And somewhere between those two philosophies, an invisible fault line began opening. For Catherine, royal life had been a long education in restraint. She had learned that joining the monarchy did not simply mean gaining status. It meant surrendering parts of ordinary freedom. Words were measured. Appearances were planned. Access was controlled. Personal opinions could become headlines before they had even been fully expressed. Over time, Catherine appeared to accept one central rule: when private wishes collided with the stability of the institution usually came first. Meghan seemed to approach that world differently. She was not necessarily rejecting royal duty, but she appeared less willing to disappear inside it. She wanted room for identity, independence, and a voice of her own. Traditions, in that view, could be respected without being treated as untouchable. Old procedures could be questioned. Expectations could be discussed. and rules that seemed outdated did not automatically deserve obedience simply because they had existed for generations. Neither philosophy was inherently explosive. But inside a monarchy built on consistency, they could not remain separate forever. The differences began surfacing in conversations about hierarchy, staff, public duties, family expectations, and ceremonial roles. Catherine understood that being warmly welcomed into the family did not automatically mean receiving unlimited institutional trust. Those were two very different things. Trust inside the monarchy was accumulated slowly, often through years of restraint, discretion, and acceptance of boundaries. That distinction reportedly troubled her. She feared that what looked like minor disagreements behind closed doors could eventually escape into public view, where every misunderstanding would be magnified into rivalry, rejection, or betrayal. Once that happened, there would be no easy way to control the story. Yet Catherine also understood Meghan's frustration. To enter a famous family and then discover that nearly every privilege came with another invisible condition could feel less like acceptance and more like permanent examination. The tension might still have remained manageable. Then, one particularly sensitive issue emerged, an issue involving access, symbolism, and the meaning of royal privilege itself. And the moment the disagreement touched something far more sensitive than personality, something connected to privilege, symbolism, and the invisible hierarchy of royal life, the quiet discomfort began turning into a genuine palace concern. According to the dramatic account now emerging, there was one request that Catherine could not dismiss as a misunderstanding. On the surface, it seemed perfectly reasonable. But inside the palace, where access itself represents trust, the request carried implications far beyond what outsiders could possibly have understood. The issue reportedly concerned greater access to certain royal privileges, private arrangements, ceremonial traditions, and pieces connected to the royal collection. To someone outside the institution, such a request might have looked harmless, even natural. But Catherine understood that inside the monarchy, access was never only about convenience. Jewelry could represent rank. Residences could signal confidence. Staff support could reveal standing. Even the ability to use or borrow something associated with the crown could quietly communicate that a person had crossed another invisible threshold. That was where Catherine's concern deepened. She allegedly worried that making exceptions too quickly could create expectations the palace would later struggle to reverse. Once a privilege was granted, withdrawing it could look punitive. Once a boundary was crossed, rebuilding it might cause even greater damage. Catherine had spent years learning that the monarchy survived through consistency, not improvisation, and she feared that generosity in one private moment could become controversy months later. More troubling was a question she reportedly could not ignore. Did Meghan fully understand the difference between something belonging to a royal family member and something belonging, symbolically or practically, to the institution itself? William was hesitant to treat the issue as anything larger than a family misunderstanding. He knew how easily tensions between Catherine and Meghan could be turned into a story of rivalry. A warning about procedure could become jealousy. A concern about precedent could become hostility. And Catherine understood that danger as well. That was precisely why she resisted speaking. She did not want to become the woman accused of guarding palace doors against another woman trying to find her place. Yet silence now felt equally dangerous. The issue had moved beyond personality. It touched the deeper question of who could decide what belonged to whom, and how quickly someone could be trusted with privileges built over generations. Eventually, Catherine raised the concern privately, expecting caution, perhaps reassurance. Instead, the reaction was colder and more serious than she anticipated. What she had treated as a delicate family matter was suddenly being discussed as something with wider consequences. Catherine had finally spoken, but instead of resolving the problem, her warning reportedly moved upward through the palace, and once senior figures began asking their own questions, the issue became much larger than two royal women disagreeing behind closed doors. Palaces rarely announce concern when concern first appears. They observe, they compare accounts, they wait. And according to this version of events, Catherine's private warning did exactly what she feared it might. It triggered quiet conversations among people whose job was to protect the monarchy from problems before the public ever saw them. What had begun as Catherine's private unease was now moving through a much colder system. Senior aides reportedly began asking whether the troubling moments she had noticed were simply the normal strains of adjustment, or signs of a deeper clash between Meghan's expectations and the rules governing royal life. No accusations were needed. In an institution built on caution, questions alone could change the atmosphere. And those questions were rarely asked directly. Inside palace culture, concern could be hidden inside carefully chosen phrases. Access could be delayed without explanation. Advice could sound like instruction. A supposedly routine scheduling decision could communicate far more than anyone was prepared to say aloud. The monarchy had spent generations perfecting this language of controlled distance, and Meghan was now becoming increasingly aware of it. Not everyone agreed about what should happen next. Some reportedly argued that she needed patience, guidance, and greater understanding. Royal life was difficult enough without every mistake being treated as evidence of a larger problem. Others were less comfortable. They feared the palace was already making too many exceptions, and that flexibility intended to help Meghan settle in might eventually weaken boundaries that existed for a reason. Catherine watched this shift with growing discomfort. She had never intended her concerns to become a campaign against Meghan. In her mind, the issue remained about precedent, trust, communication, and the long-term stability of an institution where private decisions could become public crises overnight. But once other people began interpreting her words, she could no longer control where they led. Then, Harry began noticing the change. A conversation here, a delayed answer there, the sense that Meghan was being discussed in rooms neither of them entered. For Harry, that feeling was corrosive. If decisions were being shaped by concerns they had never been given a fair chance to answer, then this was no longer merely awkward family tension. It was becoming something institutional. And one suspicion reportedly began to consume him. Had Catherine's warning helped turn private unease into palace policy? The question was no longer whether Catherine had concerns. The question was, who had heard them? What had been done with them? And what would happen when Harry finally realized that the conversation had traveled much further than anyone admitted? When Harry supposedly discovered that Catherine had raised concerns privately, the emotional calculation changed instantly. What Catherine viewed as protecting the institution, Harry could interpret as interference in his marriage. And suddenly, years of trust between two royal households were compressed into one devastating question. Who had been warning whom? For Harry, the deepest wound was not simply that concerns existed. It was the possibility that they had been discussed without him and Meghan fully understanding how far those conversations had traveled. What others viewed as caution could feel to him like judgment delivered in secret. If Meghan was being questioned, he wanted those questions brought directly to them, not filtered through aides, private meetings, and carefully worded palace conversations. His instinct was immediate: protect his wife. But Catherine believed she was protecting something too: William, their children. The future shape of the monarchy. She had spent years accepting restrictions because she believed stability depended on them. To her, raising concerns was not necessarily an attack on Meghan. It was an attempt to stop smaller tensions from becoming irreversible problems. That difference left William in an impossible position. He loved his brother, but he trusted Catherine's judgment. Remaining neutral now risked satisfying no one. Supporting Harry could make Catherine feel that her concerns had been dismissed. Supporting Catherine could confirm Harry's fear that the palace had already chosen a side. When the disagreement finally surfaced more openly, old frustrations reportedly came with it. Media treatment, privacy, protocol, family expectations. Perceived double standards. Why were some mistakes forgiven while others became warnings? Why did certain traditions suddenly become immovable when Meghan questioned them? And why, Harry could ask, had nobody spoken plainly before suspicion hardened into policy? Catherine was reportedly shaken by how her actions were being interpreted. In her mind, she had sounded an alarm. In Harry's, she may have helped create the very pressure now closing around Meghan. Neither side believed they had started a war. Each believed they were defending themselves from one. That was what made the fracture so difficult to repair. For a brief moment, there may still have been room for the anger to cool. Time could have softened the accusations. Distance could have reduced the heat. Then, another issue surfaced, one far more dangerous because it could not be dismissed as a personality clash. It involved inheritance, status, royal privilege, and the generation that would come after them. And just when the family might have stepped away from the edge, the argument collided with the one subject the monarchy can never treat casually: the future, the line of succession, and what privileges would eventually belong to the next generation. Royal families can forgive awkward dinners and even bitter arguments. Inheritance is different. Titles, jewels, residences, ceremonial roles, and access all carry meanings that survive long after personal relationships disappear. And according to the emerging narrative, Catherine's deepest concern was becoming less about Meghan herself and more about what happened next. For Catherine, the argument had now moved beyond one request or one uncomfortable exchange. She was thinking in generations. As the mother of children directly tied to the future crown, she reportedly viewed every exception through a longer lens. What seemed generous today could become expected tomorrow. What appeared personal could quietly establish a precedent that future royals would be forced to explain. That was especially true when the discussion turned to royal heirlooms. Within the monarchy, not every jewel carries the same meaning. Some pieces may be personally inherited. Others are connected to the institution, made available for particular occasions, or effectively held within a larger tradition of royal use. That distinction created enormous emotional tension because to an outsider, a necklace or tiara might look like a family possession. Inside the palace, however, permission could represent rank, trust, continuity, and the authority to carry royal history forward. One particular heirloom allegedly became symbolic of the entire dispute. It had been associated with women from an earlier royal generation, giving it emotional weight far beyond its material value. The question was not whether Meghan had done anything improper. The tension was subtler. Was access to such a piece considered too early, too sensitive, or simply misunderstood? Catherine reportedly feared that granting symbolic privileges before expectations were fully understood could blur boundaries that would later be painful to restore. But from Meghan's perspective, those same restrictions could carry a very different message. If she had entered the family, accepted public scrutiny, and taken on royal duties, why did certain doors still seem only partly open? Each limitation could feel less like procedure and more like proof that acceptance came with invisible conditions. And this was where the disagreement became emotionally dangerous. Catherine may have seen caution. Meghan could see exclusion. Catherine could see institutional ownership. Meghan might see a family deciding where she truly belonged. Neither interpretation needed to be malicious for the divide to deepen. What concerned Catherine most was what would happen once private expectations became public assumptions. Promises involving titles, access, heirlooms, or ceremonial roles could not easily be reversed without creating another storm. A temporary concession could become a permanent expectation, and any later restriction might look like punishment. The issue was no longer just about what one woman could wear or receive. It was about what the monarchy was silently promising for the future. But the jewels and titles were only symbols. Beneath them lay something far more dangerous: the belief, growing on both sides, that private family disagreements were being transformed into permanent judgments about character. Then came the detail that changed how every earlier conversation could be interpreted. Catherine's concerns, according to this account, were not raised after relations had collapsed. They had allegedly surfaced much earlier, at a time when public appearances still suggested unity, warmth, and the possibility of a very different royal future. That timing changed everything. If Catherine had only begun speaking after the relationships deteriorated, her concerns could easily have been dismissed as part of the fallout. But if those worries had existed while the families still appeared united, then every earlier disagreement suddenly carried a different weight. A strained conversation was no longer just awkwardness. A question about protocol was no longer merely confusion. Small moments that once seemed forgettable could now look like warning signs Catherine believed were pointing toward something larger. And yet, publicly, she continued performing her role. That contradiction was crucial. Catherine reportedly tried to keep private reservations separate from public duty. Whatever she feared behind palace doors, she understood that open tension would only create the very crisis everyone wanted to avoid. So cordiality remained. Smiles remained. Official appearances continued. To the outside world, the relationship could still look repairable. Inside, however, uncertainty was growing. Senior figures may have faced the same dilemma: confront Meghan too aggressively, and they risked making her feel isolated. Do nothing, and the concerns could deepen. The safer choice appeared to be restraint, to wait, advise quietly, and hope the differences settled naturally. But restraint has consequences. From Meghan's perspective, discovering later that concerns had existed much earlier could make that silence feel deeply unsettling. What Catherine may have viewed as patience could appear instead like hidden judgment. Every friendly interaction could be reconsidered. Every reassuring conversation could suddenly carry another question beneath it. What were people saying once the doors closed? That is where the tragedy hardened. Both sides may have believed they were preventing escalation. Catherine stayed cautious because she feared confrontation. Meghan continued pushing for clarity and independence because she feared disappearing inside an institution that would never fully explain itself. The palace waited because it feared rupture, and while everyone waited, suspicion grew stronger. Eventually, one uncomfortable possibility emerged that William could no longer avoid. Catherine had noticed the fractures before they became visible. She had warned that small disagreements might become something much harder to contain. Had she seen the crisis coming before he did? That question placed William at the center of everything. Because if Catherine had recognized the danger early, then his choices afterward, his silence, his loyalty, and his eventual distance from Harry, could suddenly be viewed in an entirely different light. For William, there was no painless answer. Defending Catherine risked confirming Harry's worst suspicions. Defending Harry risked telling Catherine that her warnings had meant nothing. And doing nothing threatened something even larger, allowing a private family fracture to reach the institution he was expected one day to inherit. By this point, William could no longer treat the crisis as something another conversation might repair. The problem had become deeper than one argument. He now had to decide whose version of events he trusted, and that choice carried consequences far beyond the relationship between two brothers. Catherine's influence was quiet, but powerful. She did not need formal authority to shape William's thinking. He had watched her absorb years of pressure, restraint, and scrutiny without openly challenging the structure around them. When she raised concerns, he understood they did not come lightly. That made dismissing them almost impossible. Harry, however, saw the matter through a different lens. To him, family loyalty should not vanish simply because William stood closer to the crown. He could accept differences in responsibility, but not the idea that royal hierarchy should determine whose feelings mattered more. If the institution required William to choose distance over brotherhood, then Harry could see that as proof of everything he feared. William was trapped between two forms of loyalty. Eventually, according to this narrative, he chose caution over confrontation. There was no dramatic public rejection, no single announcement declaring a final break. Instead, boundaries quietly tightened. Future conversations became more controlled. Access to sensitive palace matters grew more restricted. Ceremonial questions were handled with greater care. Family involvement became something managed rather than assumed. It was exactly the kind of decision the monarchy preferred: subtle, defensible, and almost invisible. But Catherine reportedly felt little sense of victory. Being taken seriously had come at a price. The more William acted on her concerns, the harder it became to imagine an easy return to the closeness the two households might once have hoped for. What she had intended as protection now seemed woven into a much larger separation. And that may be the most important detail of all. Catherine did not need to win for her concerns to matter. If William trusted her judgment, then those early warnings could have quietly shaped how future decisions were made long after the original conversations ended. And that is where the story reaches the present. Because the newest details suggest Catherine's original concerns were never simply archived, they may have become part of the unwritten rules still shaping every conversation about Meghan's possible place near the monarchy. Years later, the names may be different, the circumstances may have changed, and the palace doors may appear quieter. But some warnings never disappear. They become precedent. They become memory. And the most startling possibility is that Catherine's private concerns may still be shaping decisions that nobody publicly acknowledges. That is how institutions survive conflict. They remember. Even when the original arguments stop being discussed openly, the lessons drawn from them can remain buried inside procedure. A difficult meeting becomes a reason for tighter access. A disagreement over protocol becomes a new layer of caution. A broken expectation quietly changes how future invitations, private conversations, ceremonial roles, and questions involving royal property are handled. In this version of events, Catherine would not need to actively oppose Meghan for her earlier concerns to keep influencing the present. The machinery could continue on its own. Once caution becomes habit, nobody has to repeat the original warning. The boundary simply exists. For Catherine, that possibility carries its own emotional cost. Her position may have become stronger, her judgment more trusted, yet influence came with loss. The relationship once imagined between the two households, cooperative, close, perhaps even supportive, now seems almost impossible to recover in the same form. Being heard did not necessarily bring satisfaction. It may only have confirmed how far everyone had drifted. Meghan could experience the same history from the opposite direction. If she believes judgments formed years ago still shape every new approach, then even gestures toward reconciliation may feel conditional. A delayed response becomes meaningful. A carefully managed invitation feels calculated. Every closed door risks appearing connected to decisions made long before the latest conversation even began. And at the center remain William and Harry. Their deepest divide may not come from one argument at all. It may come from two completely different memories of how everything started. William could believe boundaries became necessary because warnings were ignored. Harry could believe those warnings created the atmosphere that made trust impossible. That contradiction leaves one final, unsettling question. Did Catherine simply voice a temporary concern during a difficult moment, or did those carefully chosen words quietly influence the monarchy's relationship with Meghan for years afterward? Because in the royal family, the most consequential decisions are rarely announced from balconies or written into public statements. They begin quietly, in private rooms, through cautious warnings, and sometimes, only years later, does the world discover just how much those whispered concerns changed.